And I ask you, as always, in all of our sessions, to wear two hats. One, as the person who's thinking about what they need to share with their family or their substitute decision maker. And also, it's very likely that you're going to be somebody's substitute decision maker at some point in your life. So we want you to wear that hat as well. What do I need to know in order to speak, to make decisions on behalf of someone else? So those are the two hats we're asking you to wear. So let's get started. We're thrilled to have her, as I said before. And I have to say that when COVID started, we've gone virtual since COVID quite a bit. And I have to say that when we started with going virtual, it was Dr. Mannix's voice, her words, that really helped me through COVID, because I was getting a little nervous as COVID became more, as she said, kind of stole the meaning of ACP and focused in on treatment. And I'm like, oh, no, it's not just about the treatment. And so it was Dr. Mannix who said, no. It's about the priorities in your life, and you wrap the treatments around those priorities. And so that's when we reached out to her around her first book, With the End in Mind. And so we're absolutely delighted to bring her back for her to talk about this new book called Listen. And I remember reading something very recently that said that regarding her work, it's like being taken by the hand and guided through a rich woodland of wisdom and practical tips. So no pressure, Kathryn, but I am going to begin by asking her our first question that was around the book Listen. And it does such an incredible job of taking us through the nuts and bolts of these tender conversations. So just hope you could share with us the how-to and perhaps the key principles that you weave through your book, your stories. And I'm very intrigued by the concept of the dance. So I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's really, really lovely to be here with you. I'm going to press some buttons to make some slides appear, but I promise this isn't going to be like death by PowerPoint, because that would be really ironic, wouldn't it be, in an advanced care planning discussion. But just so that I'm hiding everybody except you, Shelley. So you have to yes or no or thumbs up or thumbs down if
yep, we're good.
If anything goes wrong, just so that I can see my slides properly. So Shelley's given me advance notice of the questions she's going to ask me, just so I've got a few prompts. And I wanted really to, if I can make the slides advance, that would be helpful, wouldn't it? That doesn't seem to be happening. One moment, folks. No, slides. Oh, there we go. So I started being a little bit subversive about these conversations quite a long time ago, actually on an orthopedics ward, where an orthopedic surgeon was telling me about how difficult the conversations were and how challenging it was and how complicated it was and how challenging the family was and how difficult the daughter was being. Are you getting the impression here? And this lovely surgeon was absolutely at the end of her tether, because she was trying to talk about complicated things to a family that was on guard. And because the family was on guard, the surgeon was on guard. And I think that happens to us, whether we're professionals speaking to patients or whether it's us in our families talking to each other, that we realize that these delicate conversations need us to be courageous. They need us to use our skill. And skill isn't the thing that just happens. Skill is the thing that you learn about, you read about, you watch people go where you practice, you get feedback, you practice some more. And it's not unusual that we do feel daunted, like that surgeon felt, that this is difficult, that the daughter might be going to make a complaint, it could all feel quite dangerous. I'm going to have this conversation with my precious dad, and maybe he'll get upset. So the whole thing can feel really challenging. And we know that it's quite possible that strong emotions might come out. But the difficulty lies in us saying, well, because it's going to be difficult, I'm going to get ready, right? I've got my armor on, they can come at me and I'm going to be ready for them. And that's not the fault of the conversation, and it's not the fault of the person that we're talking to. It's just the circumstances we're in. And so I think that rather than bringing our armor, we need to be deliberately taking our armor off. And so I spoke to this orthopedic surgeon and I said, I wonder what would happen if you went back in there and you were the most tender you could be. And she looked at me as though I was all kinds of crazy, I have to tell you. But she did go back in and she did try it that way. And of course, it changed the conversation. So I've started calling them tender conversations. And I think we need to think about what's happening, whether we're speaking to a member of our own family or friendship circle, whether we're somebody's substitute decision maker and we're trying to winkle out what really matters to them so we would be able to speak to them when the time comes, or whether we're healthcare professionals and this is a serious news conversation, this is an unwelcome prognosis conversation, or whether, you know, you're talking to your other half about the fact that there isn't as much money in the bank account as there ought to be, or the relationship isn't working very well, or one of your kids isn't making the progress at school that you've been expecting. There are all sorts of tender conversations in this world, but it's not something that we do to somebody. It's something we do with somebody. It's a partnership, it's a shared endeavor, and we're jointly responsible for it. So when I first started thinking about how to write about tender conversations, I was actually going to write about a toolkit. That was my initial idea. And I could see the cover of the book and it was going to look like a toolkit, and I had all these great ideas. And then I realized that it just doesn't work, because with a toolkit, you use one tool and then you put it down, you pick up the next tool to do the next bit of the job, you put that one down, and so on. But in these conversations, what's happening is that you're layering it, you're adding a new thing and a new thing, but the old things stay there as well. You're listening, you're paying attention, you're holding the space, you're checking whether the other person is okay. And I realized that actually this is much more like a dance, isn't it? Where you are moving in time to the music, you're stepping forwards or backwards, you're trying to move together. And the other lovely thing about a dance metaphor is if you get it wrong, and I would get it wrong because I'm not a very good dancer, if you dance with me, I'll probably tread on your toes. But you'll know I didn't mean to. You'll know that was a mistake. And if you tread on my toes, I'll help you to get off my toes and we'll hold each other. And if we stumble, we'll carry on helping each other. We won't shout and walk away. So dance is a great metaphor for conversations in which two people are trying together to make sense of an idea. And almost the space that would create between us and hold with the dance moves is that space for the ideas to be held and thought about and mulled over. So throughout the book, I've used the metaphor of dance. So it turns out when you write a book that's a bestseller, your publishers immediately want another book. And I didn't think I had another book. I thought I'd come to say, this is what dying is like, folks. Bye, I'm retiring now. And actually that isn't quite what happened, because I got so much feedback asking questions about how to talk about it, that's when I started thinking about how would we have those conversations, because it doesn't matter how many times those of you who are familiar with advanced care planning conversations have that conversation. It's never the same twice. It's always the first time for the other person. So we can't really have a script where we go in to tell somebody what it's all about. Each thing that we talk about is related to what the other person just told us, which is individual to them. So I started to wonder whether we could distill the principles of the tender conversation. And when I thought that we could, I went back to my editor at my publishers and said, I think I might have the idea for another book. And that's what this book is. And it's called Listen because actually the most important part, I think, of these conversations is not what we say. It's all about how attentively we listen. So it's pretty much like With the End in Mind. If anybody's read The End in Mind, it's just stories. It's not technical. There's no jargon. It's about ordinary people going about their ordinary lives. And this time, because when I went back to my publisher and said, I think I have got an idea for another book, they said, great, but not dying. Okay, you do know what my job was, don't you? So the stories in Listen are taken from across the life cycle, from very early in life, young people, teens and adolescents, them dealing with each other, them relating to their parents, or us as parents or teachers relating to them through adult life. And yes, of course, end of life care, because where would we be if we couldn't talk about end of life care in a book about listening? And what I tried to do was distill my experience from clinical work, from being a human being, from cognitive therapy, to find out what are the principles that underlie these conversations. And then it turns out that actually, just like dancing, the best way to start is not to barge up to somebody and say, you, me, dance now. It's actually to say, at some point this evening, may I have a dance? And so to go to somebody and say, there's a thing I'd really like to talk to you about, or there's a thing I'd really like to know your opinion of, when would be a good time for you? So now the power is shared. And I'm going to talk about each of these in the next bit in a little bit more detail. But the way we listen, the listening, not to let them get over what they're saying, so it's my turn to talk, which is sometimes the way people listen, isn't it? But actually to really properly listen to what this person is saying and to check out that I've understood and ask more questions to be sure that I've really got what it is that's going on for them. So it's all about curiosity. It's all about using questions in a helpful way. And when people become distressed because what we're talking about can be hard, we allow them to be distressed, and we are their companions there as they experience that distress, without saying, oh, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have talked about that. I'm sorry, have some tissues. No, I'll make you a cup of tea. No, it's all going to be okay. Please, please, please don't cry. It's not okay for you to be distressed. You're making me uncomfortable. Please stop it. So this is the opposite of that. This is saying, this is really hard, isn't it? And I'm here for you. And have a tissue. And shall I make us both a cup of tea? And shall we have a cry together? Because that's okay. So allowing distress so people can work through the distressing thoughts, giving them the silence they need to do their thinking, and then finishing in a way that's safe for them, so we don't leave the conversation with them still emotionally naked, as it were. And then looking after ourselves so that we stay well, so that we are able to come back and repeatedly be people who can engage in tender conversations that are emotionally tiring for us. So what are we doing to look after ourselves? So I think that's probably enough of a burble from the first question. So let's come back to you. I can see you all again now. Lovely. Hi, everybody. Oh, Shelley, you're muted.
I do have to say, Dr. Mannix, that the curiosity, that don't fix it, and the silence, those, I'm sure I'm not the only one that finds those three pieces probably the hardest to get comfortable with. So I guess practice makes perfect. It's something we have to learn. So you're inspiring. I'll try and keep that in mind as I go forward. My next question for you is, given that we are celebrating National Advanced Care Planning Day this week, it's April 16th, wondered if you could highlight the conversation skills and the content in your book, Listen, that would help us with these conversations. Because as I'm listening to you, as I was reading your book, I am thinking about how we talk about how important these conversations are. And Karen, they just did a survey this summer. They know that more people are having the conversations, but still that, I think you said it in your book, not just yet kind of ideas, like, yeah, I got to have these conversations, but not just yet. So I wondered if you could talk about your book, Listen, and I know that you have a section in it called End of Life Planning. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that, advanced care planning within the context of these conversations.
Okay, so I've got a few more slides, and what I was going to do was think about that list of the attributes of a tender conversation, but take them into a conversation that might be somebody trying to talk to a family member about what matters most to them. Because I do think we get very hung up, don't we, on, Dad, what are we going to do about CPR? What's the resuscitation decision here? And it's kind of starting the conversation in the wrong place, isn't it? Where actually what we're really trying to do is understand what's somebody's worldview, what's somebody's values. So I've got a little bit to say about us as individuals, as family members, as substitute decision makers, and the way those different components might be important. And then I've also got a little bit to say about how that might translate into when those of us who are health or social care professionals are seeing people in a professional capacity, what forms of words might be helpful to start to unwrap those conversations a little bit. If I'm going on for too long, though, give me a wave. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So let's see if we can get back into the slides again and move on. So something that I think is important for us to think about is how little the public actually knows about dying. And so when this book came out, the feedback was huge from people who'd seen ordinary dying, but actually completely misunderstood it and been traumatized by what they'd seen. But an equally huge postbag of people saying, well, actually, you've convinced me we need to talk about this, but I don't know how to start. Where do you go? Or won't they get really upset? Or, you know, I'm trying like mad and my family won't listen. Or what if we talk about dying and then we can't ever be normal with each other again? So that was really interesting. And that was the perspective I was approaching writing the book from. But I thought you might be interested to see the feedback from health and social care professionals, because it's almost the same. I don't know where to start. What happens if somebody gets upset? What happens if a family makes a complaint about it? I don't know this person best. I don't know this person's social setup the best, but I know their disease the best. Oh, I know this person's social setup, but I'm not their hospital specialist who knows the disease the best. Isn't this somebody else's job? So everybody thinks that it needs to happen, but nobody thinks it's their job to do it. And that's part of the difficulty that we have. And I think you are doing better now in Canada than we're doing in the UK in starting to get real about goals of care conversations. But I'm just a little bit anxious that goals of care conversations are the pointy end of a much broader conversation that needs to be had. And the feedback was really people saying, do you know what, if this person would just sit down, stop avoiding it, let me give them a really good talking to, we could sort this out. And you can almost hear the armor going back on, don't you? So I started to think about what is it that we see when we see a real master communicator in action. And I know that we've got some master communicators with us this afternoon. So I don't know whether you use the expression in Canada, teaching your granny to suck eggs, but I do feel as though that's a little bit of this going on here. What we see is really interesting to reflect on, because they don't tell things, they ask things. There's a lot of silence. They are curious and they tolerate uncertainty, complexity, the fact that it's difficult, the fact that people get distressed. And rather trying to fix things and change things, they just offer to be curious, kind companions in a difficult place. And there's a couple of things we don't see them doing as well, which is really worth bearing in mind. When people get upset, they don't try to stop them from being upset. They don't try to reassure them out of being upset, and they don't try to take the problem away and make it their problem to fix for them. And in fact, when you watch a really great communicator dealing with somebody talking about something that's important and emotional and perhaps a little bit distressing, we don't see a really good talking to. What we see is a really good listening to. And that was the taking off point, really, for starting to think about what are the listening skills. So thinking about inviting, if I want to talk to somebody in my family, or if I'm a substitute decision maker for somebody, then I have to say to them, yeah, it's great, I will be your decision maker, but you have to talk to me about it. Please, can we set some time aside where you tell me, because it's going to really help me if I could ask you about what matters most to you. If there was a choice between how long to live and the quality of your living, which way would you lean over that? Or sometimes it's the person who's sick who wants to tell the family that they've had news, and people are frightened to hear it. They don't want to know if things are getting worse. I want to talk about it with you. But it's important that the invitation is a genuine invitation. The person can say no, or the person can say not now. So it works both ways. If the person who's asking us to be their decision maker says, okay, we need to sit down and talk about it, and I've got the kettle on and we're going to do it now, it's okay to say, do you know what? I'm really strapped for time at the moment. I've had a really difficult day at work. I've just had a terrible phone call from one of my kids' teachers, whatever it is. I'm not in the right place in my head. This is really important, and I want to give it the time and the attention it needs. Let's plan a time, but now isn't it? So that we agree with each other what the thing is that we're going to talk about, and we arrange to talk to each other about it. And then we bring ourselves to the conversation wanting to understand. And I think the most important thing here is it's not about what we're going to say. This is not about a talking to. Our job in this conversation is to understand the other person's perspective. And to do that, we can't respond at all unless we've listened first, really reflected on what they've said, which might mean asking another question and a follow-up question, and even checking out that we've understood. And I've been teaching communication skills to medical students for about 1,000 years, I think. And for most of that time, I've talked to them about giving very regular summaries to just check that what they thought they heard the person say is what the person thought they meant. And this works just as importantly in families. Dad, let me say that back to you, just to check I've caught you right. And what I've said to medical students is you should give at least one summary for every 2 questions that somebody's answered to you. And that's a question, summary, waltz. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So it turns out, actually, secretly, I've been thinking about dancing and communication skills for a long time. So listening to understand. And by listening carefully, deeply, reflecting in our own minds, not knowing what we're going to say next until we've reflected on what the person's just said, it slows the conversation down. It creates spaces. It's very different from a conversation that's saying to somebody, I'm going to the shops in 5 minutes. I know that we need milk and coffee and bread. What else do we need? Quick, 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 tell me what we need. Where all you're trying to get is information. This isn't just information. This is somebody's soul speaking to us, and we need to give it the time and attention that it needs. And so the key is curiosity, and children are our role model here, because children don't think that an answer is right or wrong. They just think, oh, isn't that interesting? So the questions are inviting the person we're talking to tell me more about. I'd really like to understand better what it means to you, Mum, to feel that you're safe. Is that about the place that you're in? Is it about the people who are around you? Is it about the attitudes of people? What would feeling safe look like to you, Mum? What would feeling understood look like? I'd like to know what it was like for you is a really great healthcare professional question when you're trying to take a history of what's happened so far to somebody who's told every damn doctor they've seen for the last 5 years, and they're fed up of giving their story. But actually to take the story in a different way, and I learned this from a psychiatrist in a hospice in England, not to take a medical history. I've read your notes. I know what's happened to you. I want to know what it was like to be you while that was happening to you. What was it like when you first had your mastectomy? What was it like while you were trying to have your chemotherapy? What ages were your children then? How was that for you? That must have been really hard. As a person is telling us what things have been like for them, or what their fears are for the future, and we are listening, there's another listener, and it's them. And we've all had that experience of trying to make sense of something in the middle of the night. You know, when you wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and it's all going around in your head and you can't make sense of it because there's so many bits. It's a bit better in daylight, but it's still, you can't make sense of it. And then somebody says, tell me what's on your mind. And now you will tell them, but you can only tell them one sentence at a time. which means you can only tell them one bit at a time. And when you think about somebody telling you their story in that way, they'll say, oh, so this happened and I'm worrying about this, and this is another thing that might happen. And then this person told me, oh, hang on, no, that person told me that. That wasn't then, that was then. And you can see they're kind of building the timeline, or they're making the jigsaw to fit all of the pieces together and make sense of it. So by helping them to tell it out loud, we are helping them to make sense of it, even though that isn't part of the making it better. That's just part of what happens as people speak aloud. So we're using helpful questions to help the person reach the fullest picture possible. And it's a little bit like their life has become a jigsaw and they're trying to assemble the pieces to make sense of it again. And questions are helping us to shake the box to make sure there are no bits left inside the box. So there are two sorts of questions that I'd like to talk to you about, one of which you're going to be more keen on than the other. So the first is questions about the current situation. Enough questions that we're really sure that we've shaken all the pieces of the jigsaw out of the box. So you've met people who will say to you, and you'll know for the people that you might be substitute decision makers for, or for your friends and family, people who almost everything they tell you is about how they feel physically, the symptoms they've had. And other people who will tell you only the thoughts and the worries that they've got. So as we're listening, we're noticing what they're saying, we're noticing what they're missing out. If they're having all of these symptoms, do they have any concerns about those symptoms? What do they think about those symptoms? What emotions come when they get that pain or find their leg is dragging or they can't remember things? So noticing what they tell us and then asking extra questions about the things they're not automatically telling us, shaking a few more pieces of the jigsaw out of the box. And then a question that helps people to start to put it together. Now you've told me all of that. What do you make of it now? Because you've thought it all through again to tell me all of that. How does it seem to you now, Mum, that you've told me all of that? And are there any things that we don't know yet? Are we missing anything here? We've talked about what's currently going on, but I wonder whether there are other concerns you've got that you're trying to protect me from. And again, that happens in families a lot. Or wondering whether there could be a different way of interpreting things. You know, your dad's looking really tired. I think the marriage is over. Oh, okay, that's a little startling. I wasn't expecting you to say that. Is there a different way of interpreting dad looking tired, apart from he's absolutely sick of you despite having been married to you very faithfully for 60 years? Could there be a different way of looking at this? So questions about the current situation before we go to the questions that we really want to ask, which are the questions about making it better, about finding ways forward. Because all of us who are here today are people who like to help people. And we like to help people by making things better. And what I'm asking all of us to consider is to stop making things better and to start helping other people to make things better for themselves. If the fix that I can think of for the quandary that Shelley is in would work, Shelley, who's a deeply intelligent person, would already have thought of it by now. So it's a little bit insulting, actually, to offer our fixes. So instead, why don't we ask people about what they've already tried, what they've already thought of, what the life experience they've had so far brings to help them to think about this new challenge in life? Is there a tiny bit of this complicated issue that could be changed more easily than the rest of it? And would that tiny win help things? Or the $6 million question, if you had a friend who told you this dilemma that you've just told me, what advice would you give that friend? And remarkably, almost everybody can advise the friend, but hasn't thought about applying that advice to themselves. So what we're trying to do is not take over, but give back control. I want you to help me think this through so I can think with you about your best way of dealing with this using your ideas, not my ideas. And as the person is describing their dilemma, we will feel the urge to fix it and to reassure them and to close down their distress bubbling up inside us. And our job is to sit on it. It's so hard. But what they need to be able to do to tell us how to help them towards the end of their lives, when there are difficult decisions to be made, is to really think about what it will be like. Who will be there? Who is already missing? What bereavements are they already thinking about as they think about their own death, for example? And so we have to allow them to feel those emotions and simply validate it. This is hard. I'm so sorry. I'm just here. I'm with you. You take your time. I'm not in a hurry. I can't imagine how hard this is for you, or I remember how hard that was for you at the time. I'm sorry that it's upsetting you again, but thank you. Thank you for telling me about it so we can think it through together now. And silence. Just shut up. And it's so hard because we want to help so much, but silence is the place in our heads where all the thinking is happening. And what's really interesting is when you tape interviews between doctors and their patients for communication skills training, the doctors will come out and say, oh, there was that really, really long silence. And I didn't know what to say and it was absolutely terrible. And then you talk to the patients and say, what about that long silence? And they say, was there a silence? Because it wasn't silent for them. It was busy for them. They were completely occupied in thinking. So if we're in a room with them, or if we're on a Zoom call with them, then we've got to think about where we're looking. There's an awful lot of stuff about eye contact that's rubbish. Think about when you talk to teenagers, do you gaze into their eyes? Or do you have your most important conversations when you're driving along, in which case direct eye contact might kill both of you? Or you're backpacking, you're out walking together. We can have fantastic no eye gaze exchanges. Sometimes when we're looking at a person, we're saying, I'm ready to talk now. Sometimes there's been a long silence and we look at them and we're saying, I'm waiting for you to talk now. Sometimes we give a signal that I know it's my turn to talk, but actually I'm going to give you another go, because conversations are about taking turns by looking away or by maintaining the silence. So think about not being overly intrusive by what we're doing with our eyes. Think about the calming of certain types of touch, touching the back of a hand, touching a shoulder, touching in a way that's safe. Would it be okay if I rub your shoulder? Is this a moment where you might like a hug, Dad, because I feel like I need one? We might be present with them. We might be able, obviously this is a British slide, make them a cup of tea. If in Canada you prefer coffee, I'm sure that works too. Using tissues, passing the tissues, but it might be that you're on the phone. And in fact, you're needing to say things. During COVID, we had a lot of that, didn't we? Where we needed to be able to say, I'm still here, but not interfere with what they were thinking about. So bland statements, it's okay, take your time, I'm still here, that they didn't have to think about. It was just saying the phone line hasn't gone dead. It's about companionship in their state of distress before we find a way of finishing in a way that's safe for them. So one of the things that can be really useful is to make sure we all know what time we're going to finish. Another thing that's really useful is to remember that we don't have to finish the whole conversation. We just have to finish in time this time. So a 5-minute warning, a 10-minute warning to say we need to wind up soon, so we won't add anything new now. And we're helping the person to be ready to face the world again. So one of the things that can be really helpful is to say, okay, we're drawing towards the end of the time that we've got now. Can I give you a little summary of what I've understood? Or would you like to summarize back what you think we've said? Do you want to see the list of things that I wrote? For healthcare professionals, it might very well be, okay, who are you going to talk to next? How are you going to contact them? How are you going to get there? Do you have the phone numbers? Do you know the way from here to the place that you're going? So we're actually orientating the person back into the here and now and moving them to the immediate future so they're ready to go there. And then arranging are we going to meet again? Have we finished this conversation? Do we need to talk again in the next few days? Or is this something where you need to go away now and have a think about it and we'll meet in a couple of weeks' time? What's the arrangement? And make it clear. But also we need to look after ourselves. Now, during our first wave of COVID, I went back to work in the National Health Service in the big local hospital trust locally. And I was part of the staff support team and communication skills trainings team. So I wasn't seeing patients directly. I was supporting staff who were seeing patients, which is a way of getting many, many more patients influenced, I suppose. I did feel a little bit guilty, I have to admit. But these are the things that staff told me they were doing after they'd had those really, really poignant telephone conversations where they were breaking unwelcome news, to take a few minutes for mindfulness. And one of the mindfulness apps was made free for all National Health Service staff to download so that they could do 5 or 10-minute mindfulness meditations between seeing patients, or just go for a cuppa, or a lot of people just wanted to not be in the heat of the hot zone, take their PPE off, see the sky through a window, go and stand in the car park. Some people wanted to use their phones to look at nature, look at family photos, listen to music, phone a friend. Mobile phones became very, very important. Some people just needed to let their emotions out, but everybody needed to find a way to recenter there and then before they could go back and offer themselves in a whole way to the next patient or to assist a colleague in the care of another patient. But we also need to think about looking after ourselves in between times too. And that might be reflection, talking to a friend, journaling, writing it out. For those of us who are professionals, it might be clinical supervision, where we sit and discuss a particular interaction with a patient that we felt we could learn from, or it didn't go as well as we had hoped, with somebody who we trust, who's an expert. And it also means having some relaxation time, so we're not full of all those stress chemicals all of the time that stop us from being able to sleep, stop us from being able to eat well. We need to look after ourselves, and other people need to be tender with us so that we are well looked after. So that was going to be my space. I'm going to talk a bit about advanced care planning differently, but for professionals, people aren't silly. We can say to somebody, is your goal these days to live as long as possible? And if that's the case, well, what are the milestones that you're looking forward to? What are the important things for you? And how realistic are those? And is there a backup plan? So I'm thinking now of a lady who I looked after who had really terrible lung disease. And she wanted to live as long as possible because she lived in England and her granddaughter in Australia was getting married next year. She wanted to get to that wedding. Now, this lady was already using oxygen for almost all her activities around the house because her lung disease was so severe. So there was no way that she was going to be able to travel at cabin pressure to Australia. She would have died. So we have to think about that really important milestone in a different way. And she started to think about, she had photographs of her own wedding, and her granddaughter wanted to be able to have a proper old-fashioned wedding bouquet like her grandmother had had. So she was able to send her wedding photographs to her granddaughter to show the florist in order to have a bouquet that looked like grandma's. We were able to plan how she'd be able to see a live stream of the wedding. And we were able to have a plan of, if you're not actually even still alive by the wedding, what will be the gift that you already will have bought and wrapped and have ready for the bride's parents to take to the wedding on your behalf? So she's starting to think about, if I'm not well enough to get to the wedding, would I still want to live as long as possible? Or would that change my plans? Where's the balance between length of life and the quality of the life that you're living? And other people are perfectly able to tell us, no, actually, it's not about length of life for me. It's all about how well I'm living. Well, what does good quality of life mean for you? What are the things that are most important for you? What are the things we need to do now so that you're living your best life? And can you envisage circumstances when those goals might change? So this lady lived to see the wedding. It was the first time I'd actually ever heard of a Facebook live stream, because it's a long time before COVID that this happened. I didn't know that was possible, but she went to that wedding, she dressed up, And she sat in the middle of the night in her living room attending an afternoon wedding in Australia. And she had a wonderful time. And then she said, it's okay, I've been to the wedding. I don't want to have complicated treatments anymore. Next time I'm so sick that it looks like I might die, I don't want to come into the hospital. I don't want to have that horrible high pressure mask thing on my face anymore and my arm full of needles to have antibiotics. Let me go. It's all about how well I live. And then the granddaughter got pregnant. And the whole thing changed all over again. I need to live to see the baby born. So this isn't a once and for all conversation. This is a conversation that comes and goes, comes and goes. It's still like a dance, isn't it? Where would you set the balance? And as life changes, the balance changes. And so substitute decision makers need to keep dancing. They need to keep coming in and out of these conversations. And that's why the conversations can't be about treatments I would refuse. They have to be about what really matters most to me, so that at the point when the substitute decision maker is involved in making decisions, the conversation is about what's this person's values, what really matters to this person. What really matters is her quality of living, is about being able to be with her family, is about being able to watch her garden grow. Oh, okay. Well, we could take her into the intensive care unit. We could put her on a ventilator. It'll stop her from dying this week. But the chances of her getting out of hospital alive are almost nil. She will not see her garden. She will not be surrounded by her family at home. Is that wrapping our care around her values? No, it isn't. But actually what we could do is have her awake enough and comfortable enough in bed that she can have somebody walk around her garden with a video camera and show her spring happening in her garden. She is too frail now to get from the hospital back to her home, or her support needs are too great for her to be at home. But she can have that last walk around her garden. We can do that for her. And that's so much more important than a ventilator and an intensive care unit. So I think that's the end of my rant. There's paperwork to fill in, of course. Who needs to know? Well, everybody needs to know. And the plan needs to be not just what not to do, not for intensive care, not for a ventilator, not for cardiopulmonary resuscitation. It has to be, hello, emergency responders. This is Mrs. McManaman, and she's got a terrible chest, and she knows she has, and she's all about quality of living these days, and she's got oxygen at home. If she has a chest infection and you are sent for, she doesn't want to come to hospital, she doesn't want a ventilator, she doesn't want CPR. Okay, thanks, but what are we to do? Manage her high temperature by using paracetamol. Please don't start antibiotics, that's not what she wants. Make sure that the windows are open, make sure there's a fan in the room, make sure her cat can get on the bed, make sure that these two people, if they haven't already called you, are aware, because these are the most important people in her life. So not just medical plans of what not to do, but introducing people to the first responders so they know what to do and what the ceilings of intervention look like. The immediate family, the friends and neighbours, they may be relatives, but I'm using family in terms of the people who matter most. And we talk here in the UK about the daughter in Australia, but she could be in Ontario, she could be in Hong Kong, she could be in India. The problem is she doesn't live locally, so we haven't kept her up to date with all the planning because we didn't want to worry her. And now she's flying home because her mum is dying. And what's this? You're not taking her to hospital. She's not going to have CPR. You're not going to use a ventilator. Are you trying to kill our mother? Because actually she needed to be involved in the planning. It's not her fault that she lives so far away. It's probably more important that she's up to date than the people who can pop in every day and watch mum gradually becoming more frail. The daughter in Australia needs to know what's going on. And then everybody who's involved in the person's care, so that they can make their contribution to the planning. Let's use their expertise. The primary care team, the long-term conditions team, the cancer team, it may be a mental health team, maybe a dementia team. The documents need to reflect their expertise and wisdom, but also the people who come out of hours, emergency services, general practitioners, community nursing, the team that comes out and gets you upright again when you fall over, when you press your pendant alarm? Do they dial 911? Do they get the emergency services, or do they put you back to bed and call your daughter? They need to know the plan. I think that's our next pause. I haven't got onto unwelcome conversations yet, Shelley, but I can in a moment if you'd like to, but I'd like to come back and see you all for a minute.
But, you know, it's the silence, because everybody's working right now. Everybody's brain is busy trying to capture all this. And I talk about, as I said, taking us by the hand and walking us through a woodland of wisdom. There's so much in what you've said, Kathryn. I remember you were the first person that really talked to us about tender conversations. You know, it's not a fight, it's not a challenge. And the depth of information here around inviting instead of insisting, and silence, all those things, to me, that is what makes it a tender conversation. And even just the word itself is a beautiful one for us to be using. So I know that you had talked about the unwelcome news framework and the compassionate framework. I wonder if there's something that you want to add to what you already said about those two pieces from your book.
Okay. So the unwelcome news framework, as COVID was devastating northern Italy, and it was clear that it was in Europe, and British people go skiing in northern Italy in the winter, so we knew that within days to weeks people would be asymptomatically flying home from their skiing holidays, bringing COVID into Britain. And I'm not going to get political. We weren't well guided, but I'm not going to go there. We who were in communication with our colleagues in Italy knew that the hospitals in the north of Italy were utterly overwhelmed. And we knew that the hospitals were almost only taking COVID patients, which meant that practitioners who were not used to looking after people at the end of their lives suddenly found themselves looking after dying people. And I was in the process of re-registering with the General Medical Council, and I don't know what human resources is like in Canada, but between letting my trust know that I could come back to work and actually getting a contract to go back to work from human resources seemed to take forever. So during that very frustrating waiting time, I got in touch with the national end-of-life care leads for the NHS to say, give me a job. I can't just be sitting here while people are starting to die in our hospitals, being looked after by people who don't know how to look after dying people. What can I do that's going to be useful? And they said, great, we'd like to introduce you to this wonderful palliative care nurse, Kimberly St. John. We'd like to introduce you to somebody who's a coordinator for the academic health science networks and a filmmaker for communication skills at Manchester University. So this little group of people were commissioned to pull together a framework for teaching people who'd never had to break unwelcome news to break unwelcome news. And not only did they have to break unwelcome news when they weren't used to doing it, they had to do it down a telephone. It wasn't even that they were in the room with these people. So we wanted it to be helpful, we wanted it to be clear, we wanted it to be simple, but we wanted it to be evidence-based. And the evidence-based that we called on was the science of conversations analysis. Now, conversations analysis is a really, really interesting science. And the people we went to were at Loughborough University, where they have a resource where they videotape consultations between patients and families and the practitioners in the hospice in Leicester, which is in the Midlands of England. And then the patient and family is asked to fill in a little questionnaire to say how well understood they felt, how compassionate they felt the conversation was, whether it actually addressed their concerns, and so on. And then the conversation is analysed to see not just what the doctor or nurse or physiotherapist or whoever said, but what they did, what were the actions, what was the body language, what were the things that correlated with a family feeling safe and held compassionately and well understood, or didn't correlate with that. And so they gave us the benefit of their wisdom, and we turned that into a set of resources that included this beautifully written summary sheet by my dear colleague, who's a palliative care doctor in Devon, who illustrates conferences when we have conferences. So this is a 5-phase, very familiar to everybody, because it describes the same things that serious illness conversation framework, for example, describes, or some of you might be familiar with another framework that's called Spikes. There are lots of different things, but they're all just ways of describing the same sensible way of doing things, that you don't start before you've prepared properly, that there's a beginning, a progression, and a finishing phase to the conversation. And then there's the stuff that you do after the conversation that consolidates, writes it down, records it, and looks after yourself. So in preparation in the olden days, we'd have found a room. We'd have made sure there were sufficient chairs for all the family to come in. Now we're doing something different. So we're saying, okay, so what is this, am I breaking news, or am I asking the family to help with the decision? Am I talking to their decision maker? And then to remember for these people who, you know, a few weeks ago, these were outpatient nurses in a skin clinic, and now they're inpatient nurses with people dying in front of them. This is way out of their comfort and experience zone. So remember that you're speaking from a place of compassion on behalf of all of us. It's okay to say we instead of I. I'm phoning on behalf of the team, and we want to be able to talk to you about this thing. So what am I phoning for? How do I need to finish this? Am I finishing by making sure they know about a stepwise change in the person's wellness, that they understand the person has died, that the person is so sick they could die and they're therefore allowed to come to the hospital? What's the purpose? How will I finish before I begin? Beginning with an introduction and checking who I'm speaking to as well. Thinking about your tone of voice, because when we are anxious, we speak quickly. Our voice raises in pitch, which is harder for people who are hard of hearing to hear. So deliberately doing that thing that we see paramedics and emergency responders doing so wonderfully, which is deliberately lowering their voice and slowing themselves down. And that changes the emotional response in the person we're talking to, and is calming and containing for them. Who am I talking to? And then what do they already know? So what we're doing is we're asking them to tell us the story so far, because as we've already discussed, as they describe the story so far, Dad wasn't well, he got really hot, he had a cough, he couldn't taste his food, he couldn't smell anything, he got really breathless. We called 911, the emergency responders put him on oxygen, they took him away in an ambulance. We haven't been allowed to visit him since. They told us it was almost certainly COVID, because in the early days, of course, there was no testing. And then yesterday they rang to say his breathing was even worse. They were putting him on a high pressure machine. They're worried he might be so sick that he has to go to the intensive care unit. Okay, they have just described a story of deterioration. And what is it that you're worrying about? Well, we're really worrying that he might be even more sick, and we hear about a lot of people dying. So now is a good time to check whether or not they're with someone. If you check whether they're with someone as you open the conversation, is there anybody with you there? Almost always the person will say, why has he died? And then actually there's no time to prepare them if he has died. So they've told the story so far. They've brought themselves to a place where they are expecting that the news now could go either way. So now we progress it. So thank you for explaining. You clearly saw how sick your dad was, and you've described to me the day-by-day deterioration since then. So today I'm ringing to say that actually he's not as bad as he has been. Or today I'm ringing to say that that high pressure oxygen therapy is not really making a difference. And I'm so sorry to say that we think that this may be the beginning of his dying. And now we shut up. And what was really interesting was in using this framework to teach communication skills in the hospital, when I eventually did get back to work, The nurses were great at being quiet. The psychologists, the occupational therapists, they were great at being quiet. But the physiotherapists and the doctors whose specialties were interventions needed to keep talking. They needed to keep saying, we've tried this, we've tried this, we've tried this. Stop it. Once you've said somebody is so sick that they might be going to die, nothing else is going in. And your job now is that companionship in their distress. Or sometimes you're phoning, and when you've got to that point, you're saying, I am so sorry that I have to tell you that your dad died earlier this morning. And my colleague, Samantha, was sitting with him, and he was peaceful and he was calm. But we can't make bad news into good news. There's no point in beating about the bush. So the progress is from them telling us they're ready now because they've told the story, into us filling in the next gap, giving them the silence in which they can take that in and work out what that really means for them. And then finishing by checking, what else would you like to know? Really interesting thing from conversations analysis that I've written in the book because it impressed me so much is, if we say, is there anything else? That begs the answer no. And if we simply change anything to something, and is there something else? It begs the answer yes. It expects that there will be something else and people feel able to ask it. To finish by giving comfort with truth if we can. So we're making sure somebody's with your mum all the time. You're allowed to come in now. Please come in by the west door, by the green car park. When you get there, somebody will meet you. You're only allowed to have 2 visitors. They both have to be completely able-bodied. I'm really sorry. We can't have visitors who are using walking frames or wheelchairs because of infection control and the need for our staff to be looking after patients. There's nobody here to look after somebody who's got different abilities. And that is so, so sad, but it's the way it has to be. And then that orientation to where you need to attend next. Who else needs to know? How will you contact them? If you need to come very quickly, who can we call for you so you can set off already? But we're starting to orientate them now to the future, finishing the call, saying goodbye, and then recording it, taking your moment to recenter yourself and reflect before going back into the workplace. It was astonishing to be making this piece of work. We made a series of short videos that went with it, and we also made a kind of training pack so that hospitals could use this, or community services could use this. And each of the videos was only 7 minutes long. So one was about the framework itself, which was me talking, and then we had a nurse talking about advanced care planning. We had a doctor talking about ceilings of treatment and intervention. And a palliative care physician talking about breaking bad news, and the telephone prompt sheets, because a lot of people have never had these conversations before. So the prompt sheet would also walk them through the phone call, but they could write the responses of the person. So they actually had a record of the phone call at the end of the call. So if you'd like to look at that, the second of these 2 links, you ought to be able to use. I think you probably have to have a National Health Service number to get into our e-learning for health portal. And also it's really chaotic website. It's very difficult to navigate. But the second one is our Academic Health Science Networks website. And that should take you straight into the diagram that we've just looked at together. And then we'll bring you into the other resources for that. So I think that's the end of my slides and my invitation for you to think about, how do you feel about the idea of being tender? And how do you think you would feel to just listen without kind of judging and deciding and fixing and reassuring and all those things that we very practical, helpy people like to do? And can you think of 2 things that you might like to try differently in your important conversations, just to see what happens? I'm a cognitive therapist. In cognitive therapy, that would be called a behavioral experiment. And I would love you to have a go. Let's see all your lovely faces again. We've still got 20 minutes to just chat to each other.
Perfect. I I was curious, Dr. Mannix, whether there was any that I'm looking at your list of principles and I'm thinking, okay, so invite instead of insist. I think I could figure that one out. Okay. The curiosity, I love that concept. But I'm a fixer. So I'm stuck in the can't sit with the distress, got to fix it, and letting silence do the work. I can do a little bit of silence, but then I'm already problem solving. So I'm just curious as to what you found when you're trying to teach people how to do this, where people most often got stuck or had trouble.
That's a great question. So one of the things that people really get stuck with is to not fix. And once they know they've got to ask questions, the question they ask is, have you thought of trying? And then they give the advice that they wanted to give anyway. So it's really, really important to catch ourselves in doing that. And I get people to play a game to do it. And you might like to have a go at this because it is very funny, because we are all fixers. And the game is that we think of a dilemma that we've got that's current, live, and not too emotional for us, because the game is really about the person we're working with doing the question summary waltz over our dilemma. So it's not really about solving our dilemma, it's about them practicing the skills. So don't do anything that's really deep and meaningful for you, because this is not therapy, and if it's going to upset you, you're not really keeping yourself safe. So things like where to choose for the family holiday, or buying a retirement gift for a beloved colleague, or that kind of thing. And your partner simply asks questions and gives summaries of what they've understood so far as you tell the story to both of you, and their questions will gradually broaden what you're discussing, and they have to not give advice, and they have to not reassure. And if they do give advice, or if they do reassure, you have to point it out to them, and then you go back to the last thing that they'd said before they did that to practice it. You just do 5 minutes, 7 minutes, and then change ends like a football match and swap sides, so that you both get to go at practicing. And what you will discover is you'll find all that inclination to fix rising up like an irresistible force inside you. So you'll notice it in yourself, but you'll also have a go at practicing resisting it. And it's almost the same thing as practicing not snapping when you feel irritated with somebody. It's that kind of, I know that I want to, but I'm deliberately not going to. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
When we debrief at the end of the game, we say to people, okay, who felt like giving advice? Almost everybody in the room felt like giving advice. There's quite a lot of laughter. Okay, who actually gave advice? A few hands will creep up. So, you know, it is a skill to be learned and a skill to be practiced. And then we say, and how did it feel to be doing that very deliberate question summary? It feels so strange. It's very artificial. The other person must definitely notice that you're doing this really weird thing. Okay. How did it feel to be listened to by somebody who was using a question summary? Oh, I don't think my partner did that. Well, actually, yes, they did. And you were so busy thinking, so busy being in the space of expanding the story and seeing the new options and exploring the edges of it, that you didn't notice the model. And actually, it really helps people. So again, in cognitive therapy terms, this is a behavioral experiment where you experience how clunky it feels to be doing question summary, and how completely liberating it feels to have somebody who's containing you by only doing question summary and giving you all the space you need to think through the dilemma.
So it's like the agenda for our next staff meeting. So as you're talking about it, and we're going to open it up to the audience, if there are any questions in the group, we get those ready. But how would you use that? Oh, because what we get in our ACP presentations is, I've tried to get Dad to talk about this, and he just absolutely refuses. I can't get him. He said, no, it'll be fine. You don't have to worry about that. How could you use that to engage in that conversation or get them to
Yeah, and I hear that lots too, and it is really, really important, isn't it? And it often is younger members of a family trying to engage older members of a family, or older beloved people who have had influence and kindness to them earlier in their lives, and they feel protective of them and they don't want to be talking about these things, or they feel that, you know, the order of play is being changed, that the generation that once was in charge and in full youth of vigor was looking after this younger person, and now this young person is, as the temerity suggests, that they're going to try and look after me. Who do they think they are? So one of the things that can be really helpful is to ensure that you maintain the relationship in which they are in charge and their wisdom and their experience is valued. So if it's a parent, to go to your parent and say, not, Dad, for heaven's sake, we need to talk about this stuff, but Dad, there's this thing that's really worrying me. And you know, sometimes it wakes me up in the middle of the night and I can't get back to sleep because I am so worried about it. And I just think if I could mull it over with you, even if it was just 10, 15 minutes or so, I would feel a lot better. Oh, well, of course, poor thing. What is it? Well, the thing is, Dad, I'm really concerned that I know you don't really like talking about your health, but if something happened and you weren't able to speak for yourself, you know that I'm the person that the doctors and nurses are going to ask about what you want. And I'm just really worried that I might say the wrong thing because I just don't know. And if you could just give me some guidelines, if we could just spend 15 minutes talking about that, I don't think we need to talk about it anymore, but at least I'll know roughly what the territory is if that ever happens. What do you think? You know, sometime over the next couple of weeks, do you think we could do that? And now you're asking him to be Dad. And it changes the dynamic. And I know this works because so many people have told me that this works for them. But sometimes what Dad says is, I absolutely trust whatever you decide to be the right thing. And that is actually permission for you to say, okay, Dad, I'm just going to ask you one more question. And the question is, of all of the things that are important to you in your life, what are the 3 things that matter most? And it's your mum, it's the garden, it's my faith, it's the grandchildren, it's what happens to the house, it's that you never put me in a care home, whatever it is. And once you know those 3 things, you've got what you need. Because now, when you're being that person's substitute decision maker, you haven't got to make the decision up on your own. There's going to be a whole medical team saying, okay, so this is what's wrong with your father, and these are the different treatment options available. And you're able to say, well, the things that matter most to him are my mum and the garden and his faith. How do they apply? Well, okay. Doctors and nurses can help you now to think through how those things will apply. And that's okay. He doesn't have to decide about a ventilator or CPR because he didn't want to talk about that. But you know what matters.
I think this group has their marching orders for National Advanced Care Planning Day. I think you guys have to go away and think of those 3 things. But in the meantime, Patty, did you have a question?
No, I was just going to let you know that there are no questions in the chat. So I think
okay.
we're going to have to do a show of hands or something in order for people to ask their questions now, okay?
So if you want to come back on, you turn your videos back on and so we can see you. Anybody have any questions? Oh, Susan, you're on. Susan, you're still muted. No?
There we go. I think I'm here on now.
Yep.
Dr. Mannix, in your book, you talked about in-betweenness. And it was a really powerful word because many of us have tests and other things go on, and we're in that in-between of not knowing. Certainly, I can see the techniques would apply in any situation, but can you say more about that in-betweenness that people deal with, and how we can provide support to them in that situation?
Yeah, I'll try to. So what I was trying to describe by in-betweenness is that state between wondering whether there is something difficult going on and knowing that there is something difficult going on. And for some of us, we're in between because we're in the process. We found a lump, for example, and we're waiting to hear whether it's a cancer diagnosis or it's just a benign lump. So we're in between, and it's not like somebody else knows more than we know. We just don't know yet. But sometimes we have in-betweenness because somebody knows, but we haven't been told. And sometimes we see this in families where the family has realized, for example, that mum is getting very forgetful. And, you know, yesterday she couldn't find her sweater and I found it in the fridge. And so, you know, we're starting to see behaviors that suggest that mum probably has dementia, but we're not talking to mum about it. And mum herself is worrying, but everybody's saying, oh no, don't worry about it, mum, you're just getting a bit forgetty, you're 96, it's normal to be a bit forgetty. But actually mum might feel quite a lot better if she was able to talk about her concerns, and we're shutting them down. So that kind of reassurance behavior. And then the other in-betweenness is a voluntary in-betweenness, which is that I know that I'm dying, but it doesn't help me to spend every moment of every day in the presence of that truth. If I actually want to spend today having a picnic with my grandchildren, which is building memories for them, then I don't have to take dying with me. Actually, I can sit and have a picnic with them, and we can talk about what we're going to do next Easter with our next picnic. Yes, I'll probably be dead by then, but it's not helpful today to think about it like that. Let's just have a day that's full of joy. And so the story that's in the book is the story of my lovely uncle, who, after his wife died, set a place for her at the table every day. And my family thought that maybe this was some kind of failure of his grieving process, some pathological bereavement. So they sent me round to investigate. And actually, I was absolutely terrified. I was a very newly qualified doctor, so I'm not really sure why they sent me around, but anyway, they did. And he was making soup, and he gave me 3 plates, one for me, one for him, and one for Auntie Al. I said, oh, where do you want me to put these plates? He said, oh, well, I sit by the door. Auntie Al sat by the window, and you'd have the place in the middle. And I realized that he was talking about himself in the present tense, but her in the past tense. And there were roses on the table. I said, oh, lovely flowers, Unc. He said, yeah, Auntie Al loved yellow roses. I buy some for her every week. Loved. Buy. Past tense, present tense. And I'm saying this like I was really noticing it at the time, but at the time, mainly I was feeling stomach churningly anxious with my heart really, really banging. And then he came in with the soup, and there were only 2 bowls of soup. So it turns out that dead Auntie Alice is not being given soup. So clearly he's doing a thing that's in between, where he's setting a place for her at table, and yet he isn't serving food to her. And then he said to me, Auntie Al and I are very, very proud of you. And I knew they were proud of me. I was the first person in our family to go to university, so it was really lovely that they were so proud. And I knew they were proud of me, but in that moment where she died in my 2nd year at university, so she'd never seen me qualify as a doctor, and I'd been qualified now for probably about a year, so this would have been 5 years later. I could feel his pride because he was sitting next to me, but because he'd set a place for her and she was with us in some way at that table, I could feel how proud she was as well. And that was such an illuminating moment of, oh, this is what's happening. He's spending time in her emotional presence. He knows she's dead, but he's not choosing to remember that she's dead every minute of every day. So I think we can have in-betweenness because the truth is not yet known. We can have in-betweenness because the truth is being withheld, usually as an act of kindness, but actually not always what people would prefer. Or we can have in-betweenness because we've chosen in-betweenness for our own comfort for a period of time.
Trying to allow silence so people can think. I'm practicing.
I just want to say, wow.
Anybody else have a question they'd like to ask? I have one about teaching grannies to suck eggs, but I'll save that one. I know that you said, Kathryn, when we were talking in the beginning about the two books, and that with the end in mind just came out of you, like it just was just part of who you are, and you just needed to get it out. And I remember watching one of your interviews where you said, well, I kept waiting for somebody to write this book and nobody was writing it, so I just wrote it. I just wondered where you're at now, you know, your mission to reclaim dying. What kind of impact are you seeing? Are you actually seeing a change? Doing lots of presentations and lots of talks.
So that's a really great question. So I knew that I wasn't going to be like the agent of change, that we have a multi-agency initiative called Dying Matters in England and in Wales, and something that's called Good Life, Good Death, Good Grief, and the Scottish Partnership Agency. So what I was doing was creating space where I could join forces with people. But the thing that has happened as a consequence of With the End in Mind becoming a bestseller is that books about dying are now things that can find publishers. And I think my publisher was very brave. Yes. But what's been wonderful is that it's not a lonely book, that there are lots of books and they're coming out, and there are more and more each year. And that is absolutely fantastic to see. So it's not a lone voice. And what you're able to see is the similarities between those books, because we're all describing the same process. So, you know, if there were books about people giving birth, they'd all be describing, you know, normal labor and contractions and waters breaking and strength of contractions and position for giving birth to the baby and all the rest of it. Well, it turns out dying is just another one of those physical bodily processes, and it's got its own phases. So you can see those truths from one person's writing to the next. But before mine, in terms of medical books talking about dying, there was Atul Gawande's magnificent Being Mortal. And before that, there was Sherwin B. Newland, who wrote How We Die, which was talking about kind of what physically happens with different causes of death within the body. But now there are at least a dozen books by people who've seen a lot of dying about ordinary dying, and you know, that's absolutely fantastic. Last week I got my 16th translation contract for With the End in Mind, which is for an Arabic version, and it's out now in several European languages. It's been translated into Portuguese in Portugal, in Brazil. It's out in 4 languages out in the Far East. And I get feedback from readers, and it's identical feedback all around the world. I saw my person die. I thought they were struggling horrible because of the noises of their breathing as they were dying. And I've just suddenly realized by reading this, usually the chapter where I'm discovering what ordinary dying looks like as my first boss, as a new hospice doctor, my first boss is describing to our favorite patient, who's a French lady, what the sequence of events is as somebody's dying. And very early on, somebody wrote to me to say, my mum died 5 years ago. And she had noisy breathing and rattling breath, and it looked like she was working really hard to breathe. And I thought she was choking. I thought she was drowning. It was terrible. I've had PTSD. I've been in therapy for 5 years. And last night I read your story about the French lady. and I slept through the night for the first time in 5 years.
Mm.
Now, it would have been worth doing if it had just been for that person, wouldn't it? Really, it was worth it. But I haven't kept count, but I've got hundreds, and it might now be even into 1,000 or more messages like that. And each of those people then becomes a voice that talks to other people to say, actually, do you know what? We can understand ordinary dying. What proportion of people who identify with your message actually get in touch with you? I don't think it'll be a big proportion. So for each one of those people who've said, this made a difference to me, will there be another 10 or 20 or 30 where it's made a difference to them, but I will never know about it? So I think what's been really lovely is to watch that happening and to become involved in the end of life doula movement, because that's another grassroots thing, which again is growing in Canada as well, where people are training to be companions for dying people. And some of them are retired healthcare professions, but a lot of them are not, because actually dying isn't a medical event, and we can train any sensible, kind, level-headed person to be an end-of-life companion. And they know their job is not to be the doctor or the nurse. Their job is to be the compassionate, calm advisor who partly is saying to the family, this that you can see and hear, this is normal, this is safe dying, but who also knows enough to be able to say, this is not normal now. Get somebody here, because this is not right. This person is uncomfortable. This person is distressed. Because a lot of families don't send for help when the person's distressed, because they think that you should be distressed while you're dying, because that's what it looks like, because that's what it looks like on the television.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it looks like on soap operas. That's what it looks like in cinema. So actually for somebody to be able to say, this is not okay, and if we get the right help, we can make it okay again, and have that confidence, is wonderful. So what I hope we're doing, and what I see you doing in Waterloo, is saying, we've got a community of concern here that will reach out into our local community and make a difference by planning ahead well, so that when the time comes, people can be more confident and will have their plans and their spokespeople lined up. And each of us, I guess, is just like a little bit of grit in an oyster, aren't we? But what's growing around the grit is much bigger than any one of us as individuals can do. And that's the pearl of people understanding ordinary dying, being confident to talk about ordinary dying, and being confident to say, I want the best possible care for me or for this person who I love. And what's happening now, this isn't it. So sort it out, please.
We're just about out of time, and Kathryn, you call them tender conversations, and it is a reflection of who you are. You are so tender and so wise, and I'm going to be thinking about grit around the oyster for a while, for a long time. And you've had such a sense of humor, and your stories are so rich. So on behalf of all of us, thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time today to share your wisdom. I'm sure you've shared it lots of times, and every time you just sound so genuine and so engaged, and so we so much appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, I'm honored to be your guest. Thank you very, very much for having me, and thank you all for turning up.
I just sent the quick feedback poll to anybody that can take a minute just to answer those yes or no questions. And I don't know, group, does anybody have any last thoughts? We've been waiting for this for weeks, and we're just so glad it's been beautiful. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I should look away while you fill the poll in, shouldn't I?
I could put it down so you can't see it.
Mine's
Yes,
done.
I would just like to thank thank you for everything that you're doing and for sharing all of your wisdom and knowledge for everybody. I think a big takeaway for me is to never, ever underestimate the power of story. And I think what you've done in the way that you write, in the way that you describe, you use stories. I think from the first time I've had conversations with you, you've shared your stories. That's how you communicate with many of us. And it's a really important reminder to us that we can get so much through story that we just cannot get through any other form of conversation. So thank you for sharing your communication skills, not just your knowledge and your wisdom, but your way of communicating, because it helps us all in what we're trying to do, which is really communication. It happens to be about health and dying and all of those things, but at the end of the day, we are all people who are trying to communicate. So thank you.
Thank you, Karen. That's really kind of you.
Okay. So National Advanced Care Planning Day this week. So back to what Kathryn said, what are those 3 things that matter most? That's what you have to think about this weekend, Saturday in particular. Saturday?
Yeah.
Yeah.
4 more sleeps. 4 more sleeps till the 16th.
Okay. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.